Namaste. Or, as they say in the South, namaste. Namaste. So I have a problem, a lot of problems. But one of them is that there's, and this is completely off the point, but do you know how there's words that you attach to a certain time you heard them or a certain context, and so every time the word comes up, it takes you back to there? And maybe it doesn't happen to you. Insolence is one of those words for me. It always takes me back to Life of Brian. Because Pontius Pilate spoke with a speech impediment and his L's with W's, and he accused Brian of being insolent. So every time, so I'm hearing this as, and you rebuke any insolence among those who know it. And it's very distracting. So I have a problem. It occurred to me that there are many, not for the first time did this occur to me, but there are many, many Gospels and other passages of Scripture, probably in every tradition, that are very problematic contemporarily, that make us go, how does that fit in with what I believe? And Bishop Spong points, that's fine, I'm teasing you, points to a truth, but I think he has the time wrong, really. He says one must never identify the text with the revelation or the messenger with the message. That's been the major error in our 2,000 years of Christian history. Yeah, but it's been an error only for about the last 200 years, not quite. It has been an error that has arisen here in the West, in these United States, and it's biblical literalism. And no matter how hard you try and run from biblical literalism, you can't escape it, because we are creatures of our culture and our context. And so even though we know it's wrong to read biblical stories as if they were newspaper accounts, we read every damn thing as if it's a newspaper account. And it gets worse if you're a nerd like me who likes history, because then even the fun reading is a historical account. And so you get to this point where you say for yourself, I don't really believe there's a hell. And then here comes this gospel saying gnashing and weeping and gnashing of teeth and burning and, And so there's a couple ways to approach that dilemma. One was a favorite of my first church, and said, we just won't read that. Well, I don't know that avoidance ever really resolves anything. It just kind of delays it. And sooner or later, if you start avoiding everything that's problematic, you don't have much left. Ironically, what you might have are the historical books from the Old Testament, which you can actually read as if they were history or newspaper accounts, kind of, sort of. But I think, and there's another thing too, before I leave Spong. No, it wasn't Spong. Where did I find that? Yeah. It was in Matthew. And at the harvest time, I will tell the reapers, more cowbell. There's just... So, suppose for a second that we just climb into a couple realities. And one of them is that all the major religions pretty much came to being, with the exception of Hinduism, during the Axial Age. And since there really is no thing that we call Hinduism, it's really a collection of things, you could argue that it evolved there. But from about 900 before the Common Era to about 200 before the Common Era, all the seeds of every major religion start springing up. And they all have one thing in common. They believed that before you could enter into the depths of the religion, what had to change was ethical behavior. That until you got your ethics straight, until you started treating other people right, there was no point in worrying about any of the rest of it. Buddhists weren't allowed to meditate until they understood the ethics. I would argue that the Old Testament law is absolutely about ethics, whether we agree with all the points of it anymore. So you couldn't jump into Kabbalah unless you understood the law. And I would even say that, turning into, who did this? Clinton? No, it was one of the Bushes? The thumb. Anyway, turning into somebody. Ten Commandments are part of that. And if we can look at that first and hold that as a primary concern across traditions and use it as a filter, and then we come to this other thing that the biblical literal... Is that a turd? Oh, no, it's right. Biblical literalism wasn't an issue until 200 years ago, and in fact, the earliest church fathers, and there might have been, some of them were mothers, really preferred allegorical interpretation. They didn't read this stuff literally. And so suppose that we come across a gospel like this and we say, what's the spiritual lesson here? What are they trying to get across? Not what are the details. You know, the literal interpretation says, you better do the right stuff or they're going to throw you into the fire. Okay? But literally, there's another problem with the story, and that's that if anybody has ever had a garden, you know if you don't weed the thing, it doesn't turn out very well.
And the sooner the better.
Yeah, the sooner the better, because it'll get out of control. It'll choke the life out of the stuff you're trying to grow. And another point is that weeds are really just, I'm sorry, I got that backwards. Flowers are really just weeds that we like. So this can't be a literal instruction of how to grow your garden, because it's not going to work out very well. And in an era in history, like the time Jesus lived, they knew about growing things. You know, it's not like he's just spouting off. So it can't be that. He can't be giving gardening advice. He can't be saying what's actually going to happen at the end of time. What's he saying? Back when I was 22, maybe not quite, moved to Rockford, Illinois, which at the time was ranking in the top 10 in unemployment in the country every month. About 25% unemployment. It was the closest thing to a ghost town that wasn't a ghost town that I've ever seen. I guess I should say the closest you could get to being a ghost town without actually crossing that line. I mean, everything was closed. And there was a circle in my front yard that had something growing in it. And I moved there in October, so whatever had been growing in there was gone. And in spring, this crap started springing up. Not only did it spring up inside the circle, it sprung up outside the circle, poking through the grass. I said, I don't know what this is, but it's out of control. I'm going to fix it. And so I went out there and I dug up and I had a little hatchet and a little saw and I'm hacking away at this crap. And I'm not even halfway through. And the neighbor comes out and says, oh, don't you like irises?
Oops.
I said, I don't even know what those are because they weren't on Janet Reiner's list of approved flowers. That we had to learn to spell when we were playing schoolhouse as a kid. But that's a story for another time. What if we recognize that we do have a natural tendency to want to sort things out? You know, even if we profess a really strong belief in God, somehow we seem to not believe that God can do that job. And so we're going to be nice enough to volunteer and do that job for God and decide who belongs and who doesn't. And pretty soon you have something not unlike a majority of political rhetoric on the internet where apparently half the people are libtards and what they call conservatives, I won't even tell you. And we start labeling and naming and separating, and nothing good comes of it. It's that kind of thing, it's that kind of black and white thinking where we say, Michael Vick is a really good football player. He couldn't possibly be doing dogfighting. Because if you're good at one thing, you must be good at everything. And if you're bad at one thing, you must be bad at everything. Or if you do one bad thing, that must be it for you. I was reading a blog I subscribe to, written by John Hagedorn, who's a friend of Gerardo Cerna's, who is a professor at University of Illinois, Chicago, I think. One of the colleges, state colleges in Chicago. Professor of sociology. And he was pointing out that we have this idea that gang members spend all their time shooting people, when the truth is that gang members spend more time washing the dishes than they do shooting people. But that's what we're sort of trained to do, is sort people out, and while that works really well, sort of in the beginning, I mean, it helps us understand, probably in cave person times, it helped us figure out who was safe, what wasn't. What's this big thing with 4 legs coming at me? Okay, I probably should run away. When it's pushed too far, we get into trouble. So maybe, and I think Jesus is even hinting at this when he starts explaining the parable a little bit. Maybe we shouldn't be worrying about that. Maybe we're not really called to decide. Maybe we're not really called to be sort of the person who does the first interviews in HR for God. You know, where we ask a little screening questions and filter some of the people out so that God doesn't have to take the time to deal with those people who we know so obviously need to go over there because we've seen them throw a football or have some dogs fight. And on that basis, we know the whole picture. Maybe the point is, let it go. People are going to do what people are going to do. And we can try and say, you know, Fred, maybe that's not the best thing. But if Fred doesn't want to listen, Fred's not going to listen. And it's not up to us to sort it out. It's up to us to love, which means we want what's best for the development of that individual, which may or may not mean that we have anything to do with them. We don't have to make decisions about, oh, you're fine. We don't have to make decisions about who ought to be welcome, who's not welcome, who's in and who's out. Can you come in here if you're, not wearing a jacket? That's an exercise in missing the point. It's all an attempt to play God on one level or another. I gave an Uber ride to a group of people last night. Yeah. Well, Northwestern Mutual is having a big convention or something. And I picked up a carload from Portland, Oregon. And the guy in the front wearing a beater with his hat crooked was probably the most obnoxious racist I've ever seen in my life, or heard, and made this assumption that because we all seem to be more or less Caucasian, I would be receptive to hearing his rhetoric. And then he shifted to his politics, and I said, well, I suppose now all that's left to talk about is religion and sex, because we've covered everything else, right? Again, he made the assumption about who thought what, who believed what, who was in his pile, who was in the other pile. And it backfired on him tremendously. And those situations too, I think what Jesus is saying is, we may or may not be able to change that person's mind. We're probably, in most situations, not called to confront it directly. But we are called to learn from it. There's, those motivational posters? I probably talked about this before. My favorite one was a picture of the Titanic sinking. And on the bottom it said, failure. It said, if nothing else, you can always serve as a bad example for somebody else. there's value in every experience, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And it may be that we do our best learning up against the ugly. You know, the Dalai Lama has said that your enemy is your best teacher, because your enemy will show you what's in you that is responding to that. And it will probably be not the best side of you. What do you think?
I like the idea that, you know, what's being said in that parable is like, see, there are some people who will take it literally.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, but I look at it kind of like that it's, you know, in that story, Jesus is kind of saying, like, sort of let it go. It's not up for you to know who's what, just be. And in the end, you know, it'll be, if that's kind of the, ultimately it's God or whatever that is going to take like the weeds from the wheat, and like, just kind of reinforcing that idea that it's not up to us to judge. It's not up to us to decide who goes where, who should stay, who should go.
Because ultimately we lack the information.
Well, yeah, and that's, you know, for me, I look at it as, well, we're all human. We all belong. You know, we just need to learn how to coexist instead of choking the life out of one another, which is what so often we do. And it's like in that case, you know, who's really the weeds in that parable?
I see it as the weeds, you know, to use your own discernment. The weeds, if you want to bear the fruit, you need to get rid of the weeds. If you want to bear the heart of Jesus, then you take out those weeds that are preventing you from an open heart and open mind. You take the things out of your life that are restricting your spiritual growth.
Yeah, on an individual level, I think
Right.
so. I think, but to say that there's no value in this person, just because there's no value in them for me, is, I think that's where the error comes in. And we tend to look at that, you know, if you think about it, with the wheat and all that, he was making an agricultural analogy and saying, here's what we do with the wheat. We shake it out, we get the chaff, we burn the chaff. And he's using that to teach about what happens at the end. And we almost read it like, oh, so the reason that they burned the chaff was that God burns people. It's like, no. It's the other way. It's the other way, you know, and all analogies fall somewhere. They all limp, like theology prof used to say. So, you know, people getting sorted out to who's good, who's bad is a process like we do with wheat and chaff. And then we burn the chaff at the end. It doesn't mean we have to accept that people are going to be burned at the end. That may be an exercise in missing the point. But I agree with you. I don't think we're called to, here comes, you know, Miss Toxic into the room and sits down. We're not called to walk over and go, hey, you want to come over for dinner?
No, but you still treat them with loving kindness, no
Yep.
matter how cruel or bitter or whatever, because when I see that, to me it's automatically, wow, I'm so sorry you have such a shitty life. You know, God, what do you need to do to make it better? You know, but that's not for me to judge either, so if they're willing to talk, that's fine. But,
And can they hear it and can they see it?
yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Are they ready or are they not? Or are they actually like reaching out for some sort of, you know, look at how bitter and angry I am. I don't want to be like this. Please, somebody stop me.
Yeah.
Yeah, what's in the mind of all this?
Peg's thinking I can hear it.
I have an observation and then a pondering question. The observation is that I would push back even before biblical literalism. That is one cause of the misfocus. But I think even when the Western Church started to get into the whole catechism kind of thing too, because we also have people who err on the side of being, catechism Nazis, and if you challenge, this particular view of the Trinity or this particular view of, which rubrics are, so what should be primarily a focus on how to behave in a way that reflects the presence of God working in you and through you, and has become the beliefs, whole system of beliefs that even goes beyond what it seems reasonable for people to believe.
Yeah.
My question is whether, and this is where I think I really like what you pulled from Spong, Jesus, human, divine, in an historical context. So, to some extent, as he was muddling through his humanity, if these words actually came out of his mouth,
Right.
as opposed to reflected and after his death way of putting stuff together, was he really in a place to turn around at that time and say, actually, some of you don't even believe in the resurrection. There is a resurrection, but it's actually not real either.
Right.
In a way, I like the non-dualism of the first part of the parable. Of, there's going to be
Yeah.
and it's in each of us. The mix is always there. Let it be. Let it work its way through. But I wonder if we make too great an assumption that that's the totality. Because at one point he also said, it's not right to give the food to the children
Right.
to the dogs.
Well, and don't you think, one of the great problems is, from a traditional preaching perspective, you can't say something too far out there for your audience, or you're going to lose them, like in a traditional congregation. So let's say I have 200 people listening to me. It's that 10% that isn't quite ready for it that's going to be your problem, and the further out you go, the bigger a problem you're going to create and the more people it's going to impact. And I think Jesus probably faced that same challenge. Whether this is what he said or whether it's what people remembered or how they remembered it. That's the other thing. The biggest adjustment I had when I first started preaching regularly was people coming up to me and say, I just love where you said ABC. And I'd scratch my head and I never said ABC. So she was hearing something. It was Linda, SP. Well, this woman would always hear stuff I didn't say. No, it was good stuff. It wasn't objectionable, but I certainly had never said it. So who knows if the people that heard what Jesus said heard it right or if it got down right. But that's another reason I think we need to just kind of hold all that stuff loosely. And that's where the Kalama Sutra comes in handy, because the Buddha never said, don't believe what I said because I said it. That's a misquote. This is what he said. So you take the reading, you try out the different applications of it. You look at Jesus supposedly said this. What part of this makes sense to me? Does it not make sense? Does it work? How does it work? And the hang-up is when they made Jesus into God, now all of a sudden you can't play with his words. Now all of a sudden you can't analyze it. Now all of a sudden you can't think about it. Who are you to question God? And I think that's...
See, I think, you interpretation. Much like with anything else that we read, it's all, I think, based on our own experiences, our own lives.
Oh, yeah.
You know, how we look at things and take it. And I think that's one of the things when people get so caught up in like the literal, you know, like what is it? That they're really missing the whole point of it. What did you say? Exercising to see the point.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, because you know it's even any time we come to anything, be it biblical scripture or if we were to look into like Quran, like other things, it's what our own life has taught us and what we've been through that shapes how we view sort of things. I mean, there's no way to look at anything and have every person on the earth do the exact same meaning of it, even if it is a literal, something literal. We can look at it, like you make a math problem, that's literal. It's but we approach it different ways. We'll do, so it's. I think people try to get hung up on the literal. It's not even possible, and that itself is like an exercise.
Yeah,
in
'cause
utility.
it's all Marshall McLuhan was a communications analyst in the 70s from Canada who said, you cannot not communicate, and I would say you cannot not interpret, because you're right, and there's no frame of reference we can look at something from but our own.
Every interpretation is individualistic.
And that's why I included this insert, actually. Little summaries from Richard Rohr the last week talking about faith and belief, but the idea of the first one. Could Christians migrate from defining their faith as a system of beliefs to expressing it as a loving way of life? Or the bottom one on the front side. Our faith is not a belief that dogmas or moral opinions are true, but a faith that ultimate reality, God, Jesus, is accessible to us and even on our side. Jesus was able to touch and heal people who trusted him as an emissary of God's love, and here comes the catechism, not people who assessed intellectual statements and decided whether they were true or false.
The thing about that one is that he healed people who didn't trust either.
Mhm.
That's scripturally.
Right. Well, and perhaps as a vehicle, maybe the touching did the healing.
That's, I think that in that, we gotta look at what did we learn from that? That it's not just the people who are on our side that we should help.
Right.
It's everyone. It's help who you can, when you can. And maybe that's something to take from that.
And then like Monday's reflection too. Reflection. The settled system of belief, Christianity then became unleashed or a locked door.
The McLaren is an early person from the emerging church movement, which when it started they said, oh, define your beliefs, what's your creed? And they said, we won't. Because once you write something down, then it's locked and it doesn't evolve and it doesn't change, and 5 minutes later it's outdated. So we're not
Things
going
always change.
Yeah, yeah.
Change is inevitable, that's what I believe.
When I was a child, we had to stand around the room in school and recite the catechism, whatever part we were assigned, and we couldn't sit down until you could recite the first page or the first...
From memory?
From memory. So you see, it was ingrained in people to follow the catechism. Somehow or other, it didn't change.
Maybe it just wore off.
It wore off. I think it wore off.
It didn't help when it expanded to like 700 pages of arcane.
Yeah, I got one of those, and I read the first paragraph, and I said, because it was written in the old church language, and it's just I couldn't finish reading.
Like the Book of Mormon?
Yeah, that's that too. But it was just the way everything was worded. It- I have to go back there. You know, over the years, I've come to believe in a couple things. One is, Jesus was showing us what God was like. You know, when you think about the prodigal son, that's a picture of how God welcomes everybody back, no matter what they've done. And the other is the way he lived his own life. You know, taking care of people who were sick or who needed help, whatever. The rest of it is drops.
Well, the Father forgive them for they don't know what they're doing. That's a pretty good lesson too.
Yeah, it's not that there's nothing else. I mean, those two things have just...
Thank God he didn't quote Psalm 137.
Yes?
Blessed be the one who dashes the heads of their infants on the rocks.
That was not Jesus.
That's
That was
person,
David.
Charles Case.
These and orphans taste the same as burritos.
You're disgusting.
Seagulls and rattlesnakes.
Yeah, what the hell is that?
And that's a Jay quote. He just says a few things.
And that's what I mean, it's like, who cares?
I was looking at a seagull. Should we pray?
But if you look at it, rattlesnakes live in dry environments, and seagulls live around water.
But rattlesnakes taste like chicken.
That's what I said.